Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for making the time to attend today's webinar. I'm Kim Strom. I'm a professor here at UNC and also the director of the Office of Ethics and Policy. And really want to say thank you in advance to the panelists who we have here today and for their, what I know will be a thought-provoking and an educational presentation. This is Global Ethics Month, and my office, our office, has been active in a number of events weekly on various topics. We urge you to look at our website, Ethics and Policy at UNC, and we'll be putting information in the chat about both our office and also the other resources that may be relevant in illuminating the issues that we're talking about today. As you might imagine, given the title, talking about reflecting on 9/11 and the immediate events and leading and healing, this is a topic that evokes a lot of feelings, a lot of memories, some of which may be painful and troubling to folks. And we want to acknowledge that and provide a warning and an encouragement for folks to take care of themselves in this space of this conversation, and to let you know that we're mindful of the power of this topic. I also want to thank my staff in the office, Jen Daniil and Matthew Teal, who are working behind the scenes to help all of this go smoothly, and to our undergraduate interns in the office who will get to see what leadership on campus looked like 20 years ago, and also how important the things that they're working on really are. So let me invite, I'll call on each of the panelists as I see them on my screen and invite them to introduce themselves, tell you what roles they played, where they at the time of the 9/11 attacks, and then also to tell you what they're doing now. So I'll start with you, James, please.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to all the other panelists who've gathered here today. I'm James Measer. I was the 9th chancellor of UNC-Chapel Hill. I came to Chapel Hill in 2000. That was my first year on campus. And of course, the events we're talking about today took place almost exactly a year later, on September 11th, 2001. So that's my connection to the event, and we'd actually planned for the beginning of the Carolina First campaign to start that, I think, to kick off on University Day in October of 2001. And of course, those plans were all deferred because of the enormity of the event that took place on September the 11th.
Right. So let's get the other panelist introductions, and then kind of I'll kick us off to the recollections. So Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh Canzona. I have a PhD in religious studies from Georgetown with an emphasis on religious pluralism and Christian Muslim understanding. I work now as the Associate Ombuds at UNC, and our office works to help everyone on campus approach conflict and other challenging situations constructively. My teaching sometimes at Wake Forest University focuses on dismantling Islamophobia.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Jasmine?
Yes, hi, I'm Jasmine Vandas. I'm a 2017 master's graduate of the UNC School of Journalism. I'm currently the host of a podcast called Me and My Muslim Friends that is produced in partnership with WUNC. I'm a native North Carolinian. I did my undergrad at Wake Forest, and my background is that I'm half Iranian and half Algerian. Looking forward to talking to you all.
That's great. Thank you. Raj.
Hi, everyone. Raj Punjabi here. I was at UNC as a senior the year this all happened with Justin, my dear friend who's on the line. And I was serving in the capacity as the co-president of the Campus Y, and had been asked with Chancellor Meiser and Justin to help rally the campus community in the aftermath of 9/11. And now I went on to medical school at Chapel Hill, and then I'm a physician. I work as a public official. I'm here today in my personal capacity as a proud alum of the school.
Great, thank you so much. And Justin.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Dr. Justin Young, but of course, as Roger already mentioned, back then, 20 years ago, I was just Justin, student body president at the time. And, it was such an intense moment, but like Raj mentioned, being there on campus during such a pivotal time, it was incredible to kind of experience what it meant as a community to experience what happened on 9/11, and also how to, at least start to process and heal in the best way that we could after those events as well. And so that was 20 years ago. Currently, I work for a healthcare tech company called Carbon Health. And yeah, I'm just happy to participate and, experience this with y'all.
Great. So let me start by sort of taking you back to where we were on 9/11. I don't think that there's anyone who was alive on 9/11 who can't recall where they were when they first heard of the attacks. I was the interim dean at the School of Social Work here, and I was in a meeting when someone came in to let us know about it. And, recalling the questions and the decisions and those kinds of things. So how about for our panelists, if you can just briefly take us back to that day in the roles and places that you were at. Who'd like to?
So Kim, I was in a vice chancellor's meeting we had our regular meeting on Tuesday mornings at 8:30, and about 9:30, someone knocked on the door, came in and said, a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. And we quickly adjourned that meeting and went to Carroll Hall so we could watch it on, and we watch it on television. And we actually saw that we were in the room when the second plane hit the building. So it was obviously very, very shocking.
Great.
Justin joined us in Carroll Hall, by the way.
Right,
Yeah,
Justin.
I remember the morning, and it's still pretty surreal now, recounting it and thinking back on it that day, but probably started my day a little bit earlier than most students do at that point. I think I was up probably around the same time that the vice chancellor meeting was taking place, and I was heading over to the student government office just to kind of check on things and get the day started over at the student union. And I remember getting texts and phone calls from friends who had mentioned that there was something going on. There was this weird, message about a plane flying into the World Trade Center, and I remember immediately getting a message and running back downstairs in the student union at the time, which was a lot smaller than it is now. And there was a huge kind of TV, big screen TV in the cafe. And I think everybody kind of gravitated to it, looked at the screen and, saw what was unfolding. And so at that point, I remember basically running through the union and then trying to make some phone calls to all the necessary parties that I needed to, obviously reaching out to the chancellor, to James, and called his office. He wasn't in his office, and then found out that he was over at Carroll Hall. And I vividly remember running through the pit, crossing the quad, and going to Carroll Hall, which had just been renovated. And so there were big screens, in the lobby. And as you walk in, you kind of see it all playing out. It was replayed all day. I think we set up like projectors in the Great Hall at the student union as well. So I vividly remember all of the screens that were, focused on that. But when we got to the dean's office over at Carroll Hall, I knew like we started to kind of have the conversations about what needed to happen and how we needed to bring the community together and start to, address this or, process what was going on, because this was definitely nothing we were prepared for.
Great, thanks. Raj?
Well, to be honest, had slept in that morning, like perhaps some other students had. And so I was woken up by a call from a woman I was dating who would later become my fiance and my wife. And I woke up and saw the first plane on TV and then darted over to the campus and had come over to where those screens were at Great Hall and at the Student Union. And, I think my mind was on two things. One was those who were still stuck in the buildings at that point and who later would die, and those first responders that were at the doorstep as well and throwing themselves in harm's way. And my other concern was around as it became more clear that Al-Qaeda was the culprit. I was just concerned about, of course, being a person who is brown, and I'm Hindu, by background I'm Hindu, I'm not Muslim, but I had many Muslim friends and also many brown friends, and were worried about the potential retaliation that may arise from that. And I have to say, to have a chancellor and a student body president at the time who were also thinking about those two things was really a blessing. I think I took it for granted at the time, but and we'll perhaps talk about this later, but that of course became an inflection moment for how the country viewed people who practice Islam or are of brown skin color. And now as I look back, I think it was actually just an incredible show of leadership to balance both of those needs for compassion on all parties who were suffering or potentially to suffer.
Thank you so much. Jasmine?
9/11, I was 10 years old. I was sitting in my 5th grade classroom at Brunson Elementary in Winston-Salem. We had those big box style TVs that are screwed into the top corner of the room that usually only have the time on them. And a lot of teachers had just suddenly gone into the hallway, and my teacher opened the door and they had a chat. She came back in the room and turned the TV on, which was unusual for news to be on the TV. We usually didn't use the TV for that. And at that point, one of the towers had been hit. No one at that point knew what was going on. I do remember my teacher being very upset, but none of the students at the time, we're in 5th grade, we didn't have an understanding of what was happening. I think for me, going back into the mind of a Muslim kid, again, I think I mentioned this before, but I should mention it now. I'm only speaking on behalf of myself and my own Muslim experiences. There are many other Muslims my age who might be uncomfortable to talk about this topic, whether it's because they've dealt with Islamophobia or whether it's because they've felt they've had to defend themselves most of their life. It can be an uncomfortable topic. So I'm just here speaking on behalf of myself. So I do want to say that. But as a kid, I knew that I had a different religion than other people. But I think after that day was when I realized we weren't just different. People thought we were dangerous, or people didn't like us and even hated us. So that was probably the big shift.
Thank you. And Josh, you on 9/11.
Sure. I was 19. I was in my 2nd year of college down in New Orleans. And I think I had 3 moments of realization that day. I was driving to school very early for an exam, and I heard on the radio about the first tower being hit. And there was still speculation at that point whether or not it might have been an accident. And then I went to the university center moving across campus. And like Justin said, at my school as well, they had large TVs set up, and students were standing around kind of in shock watching the imagery of the second tower that had been hit. And I remember thinking in that moment, I was shocked at the loss of life. And Also, I was just out of 4 years of high school ROTC, so I had a lot of friends in the military, and I was already thinking, what would this mean for them? And so then I went up to the hallway where my class would be, and there was a woman standing there on her cell phone sobbing. And she was trying to get a hold of someone in New York. She was afraid someone she knew had been killed in the attack, and she was despondent. And so I think, that image has stayed with me as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So obviously you were all in different roles and spaces and positionalities at that time. Wondering what stands out for you, or expanding a bit, what stands out for you about the decisions that you had to make, or that you observed being made, and at that time. And Jasmine, I'm going to start with you, because I wonder how soon, how you saw it being handled, and how soon you felt the sort of it becoming focused on Islam as the target, if you will.
I mean, I'd say that was pretty soon. For me, obviously, like the other people on the panel, I don't have, like a college campus focus or policy focus, but I can tell you how things changed, even within my family, or conversations that I heard my friends having with their families. So growing up, I think maybe even through high school, there were times where my mom would make it very clear to us that she thought there were certain situations where she would be uncomfortable if we shared that we were Muslim. And that was just for our safety. And at the time, I became really defensive and upset about that. I didn't like having to hide a part of my identity, especially my faith. I realize now, though, that as a mom, she was just worried. She was very in tune with what that climate was, probably more so than me. I remember also when I was 16, I had gone to Iran with her. My mom's Iranian. And at that time, she was like, maybe just tell people, you went to see your family. You don't need to tell them, you were in Iran for the whole summer. So just certain things like that. I think she was just worried about how people would perceive me. I mean, I've had friends, for when they've decided to wear the hijab, they've actually been discouraged by family members sometimes out of concern for their safety, because they would be visibly Muslim. So those are conversations, I would say, in my bubble at the time, it was more parents and family that were guiding how we move forward during that time.
Very helpful, thanks. Josh, how about you in terms of key decision points, either for you or for the people around you?
I think I became aware of how little I knew about the world. And so I think a decision for me was to seek out lectures, events on campus, like find ways to learn more about the world as a whole, but also about Islam and Muslims. And at one of these events, I remember there was a member of the crowd from the public who was heckling the professor. And I'd never seen anything like that before. I think maybe that was the first time I saw that learning and knowledge can be controversial or dangerous, right? And she, of course, the professor, she pressed on despite what he was saying. And I think part of leadership is making sure that, what happened on 9/11 doesn't disrupt the central educational mission of universities, or what we do to embrace our common humanity. I think I was seeing that already then.
Yes, thank you. So our three panelists who were leaders on campus at the time, can you share sort of the key decision points and your thoughts about how you decided to respond in the short term to the attacks?
Well, the good news is that we had all of the decision makers in one room. We had, because I was in my vice chancellor's meeting, so all of the vice chancellors were with me, and Justin Young, who was the student body president at the time, soon joined us. So we had basically, except for the staff, the decision-making hierarchy of the university in one room, fortunately. And so we could, and we knew we had a crisis on our hands. I think it became very apparent that we needed to have an all-campus convocation the very next day. That was apparent. Classes were already suspended, were canceled, and I think that gathering, which and I've seen, there's a great picture in the alumni magazine of 10,000 people gathered on Polk Place, students, faculty, and staff. The speakers were myself, Justin, and Raj in their roles as student body president and co-president of the Campus Y, and most significantly, Richard Cohn, professor of peace, war, and defense, who talked about the background of terrorism. Why terrorism exists in our world in the 20th century, and why the Muslim world has so much hate for us. And so that was and then Stephen Stanley was the last speaker, representing all the campus chaplains, and then the Loreleis sang, and then I asked everyone to leave in silence. And I think initially our two concerns were consolation for the grief that was being expressed and the fear. Remember, we were very afraid. All of America was very afraid because we didn't know whether this might be one of many attacks. And the other concern was, and I remember saying this, we must not respond to hate with more hate, with intolerance, with more intolerance. I think all of us were very concerned that we not turn on our Muslim students, that they not be seen to be blamed for this horrible act. And so I think that was there were many decisions, as I said, in the convocation. There were many decisions that we hadn't made yet. There was a football game scheduled for Saturday. Ultimately, that was canceled because I said, but I said at that time on that Wednesday that the game would be, we would play the game if other universities were playing games, we would cancel the game if other, depending on what the ACC and the NCAA did. And ultimately those decisions were made to have no football games on that Saturday. So the impact was enormous.
Before we get to Justin and Raj and their response with their constituencies, I will just say it seems to me like a bold decision to have Richard Cohn. I mean, you went there, or the convocation went there about terrorism, about the Middle East, about it would have been easy to have it be quite superficial and more healing than really. I mean, there was already I would say that was a real educational.
It was.
And I was there at that event. And also I think that having us leave in silence, I don't know if that was you know, if you just called an audible on that or if you had planned it, but I think that was also part of the sort of the spirituality of the event,
yes,
if you will. So Raj, I'm going to come back to you, James, in a second about the leadership hierarchy, but Raj, Justin, what are some of your recollections?
I mean, I think I still strongly remember those like guiding principles. I know Raj touched on it a little bit as well, the compassion and the support in making sure that we're not reactionary in our response, right? I think it would be extremely easy in that context to lean on the anger and the, the sadness and some of the rage that could, erupt from that. But what I really truly remember about being at Carolina in that moment, and quite frankly, being like a leader at Carolina in that moment, I remember us coming together to kind of recognize, like, look, we're an institution of higher learning. We're a leader in that endeavor, and in line with our mission, we wanted to make sure that we were getting curious about what we were experiencing, and knowing we didn't have all the answers. I think leaning in on supporting and bringing the community together was key. Being supportive for our Muslim community, and in particular Muslim students, in providing that support was another valuable piece, to that puzzle. And I specifically remember, one of my English professors who passed away, reaching out and asking him, Professor Kirkpatrick, I have no idea what to say. Like, how would we even approach this? What do we do? And I remember, and carry this with me, this poem or this excerpt from The Once and Future King about this statement from Merlin when he's talking to King Arthur. And remember reading that excerpt during the ceremony. I had never seen a crowd that big. I had never been a part of anything, that big, but feeling very connected to the crowd that was there. And even in the days after, I think we took steps and had decisions to kind of really reframe how we looked at the world around us. And it was such an inflection point that the way we would navigate through the world and experience the world was going to forever be different as a result of what happened that day. And so utilizing the resources and the knowledge that we had at the university, it really helped to provide supportive understanding and just exploration about what was going on at that moment, that I think was really, really impactful and really special. But again, I also distinctly remember the balance that we brought to the table by including so much of the campus community, and in particular feeling supported and kind of finding my way to understanding and making, like, discovering certainty out of all of the chaos that seemed to be, occurring, by uniting with, fellow students like Raj, and making sure that we were looking out for each other in that way.
Yeah, I remember that event at Polk Place, and I remember speaking about, I had seen extreme violence as a child. I'd grown up in West Africa and Liberia, and in fact had come to North Carolina by way of being a refugee of the Civil War there in 1990. I was 9 at the time, and this event, I think, took me back to the horror that I'd seen as a child, because it was another act of extreme violence. And what I learned in Liberia is that, which was a civil war with obviously a very different narrative, but there's some common threads. Extreme violence, in part, is rooted in extreme deprivation, and it's rooted when leaders sensationalize people's identities, and they use their identities to pit one against another. And I was really worried at that time that I'd say as a 20-year-old at the time, I couldn't necessarily articulate all of this, but the feelings were nonetheless the same. That feeling of fear, and that people's identities would be used or as a way of retribution for the attacks, violent retribution. In the weeks after that event, there were two threads, I think, of action, right? One was the words that were said that day. I think that night there was a candlelight vigil, if I remember correctly, in the pit that the students had also organized. And many students needed an outlet to act on, and there were really two forms of solidarity, which I just was so proud of the community for moving forward. One was the relief efforts that needed to be organized for immediately Justin, myself, other student, the student body itself, the student organizations like the Campus Y, and many others, including the Muslim Student Association, the South Asian Student Association, all organized to raise money to send to New York to both those who'd been victims of and the families of those who'd been victims in the destruction of the World Trade Center, and the firefighters and other first responders who also lost their lives and their families. So I remember organizing was a relief fund and also a scholarship fund for their kids, and with that also was a commitment of solidarity to the Muslim community on campus. So a few weeks later, a number of us, asked the Muslim Student Association. I think Justin, you and I talked to them maybe in that first 24 hours and asked, what could we do as a student, as fellow brothers and sisters, to show solidarity? And they had this idea of holding a rally right in front of your office, Chancellor James, if you remember. I think at the very same spot where you had organized us for that convocation of the whole student body community. It was about a month later, and we all wore kufis,
That's right.
the hat that is a symbol of peace that men who follow practice Islam often wear, and hijabs if you were women. My eventually became my wife, Amisha, Hindu, also wore the hijab, and that was to be there in solidarity and to show that solidarity. I remember we all created pins that said Islam means peace, and it was such a small, modest showing of solidarity. But I remember the words of the student body, the Muslim Student Association colleagues who spoke to all of us. It meant a great deal to them, and so I think that. There's one of those nights when we're raising money. I think I remember sleeping at the Campus Y, or falling asleep on the couch, and there was a poster with the mission of the Y, and the mission, the Y was created, really took off during the civil rights movement on campus, and their mission statement was sort of developed in that same context, and it stuck with me ever since. It says the pursuit of social justice through the cultivation of pluralism. And what is it if not pluralistic for a university campus to be able to hold both the needs of those who were attacked and the needs of those who could be attacked, and despite everyone coming from different backgrounds. I thought it was an intense period, and one that I just, again, feel very proud about the Carolina community for expressing that kind of tolerant, proactive solidarity with all who were suffering.
Before we either others of you speak to this or we move to another topic, let me just say for folks in the audience, we welcome your questions, and those will be sort of posted, and our plan is to talk for another 20-25 minutes or so, and then then do a Q&A. So if you have questions, by all means, feel free to submit those. But before I get kind of go on, Chancellor Measer, one of your points was, having the decision-making, the leadership hierarchy in the room. And I think over the past few years, we've become sort of acutely aware of the hierarchy that is not on campus, but that's very much a part of the decision-making affecting the campus, meaning our boards of trustees and governors and the legislature. And I wonder if part of your decision-making involved those bodies, or whether you felt you had sort of authority to do what was best for the campus. Was that at all part of the equation at the time?
No, no, it was not. Clearly not. If in normal circumstances, I probably would have made calls to the system president and the chair of the board of trustees, but I didn't feel we had time for those kinds of niceties. We needed to act, and we needed to act in the moment.
And it was, and so I guess the acting also meant there probably wasn't time to confer with other presidents of
No.
the state
Clearly not.
Thank you. Thank you. So the plurality question and the unity of the moment, a lot's been discussed about that, especially around the 20th anniversary recognitions in September. Is that, so I'm interested in a couple of folks to weigh in on a couple of points, and I'll let whoever wants to jump in do so. One is, if that unity at the time was, to the extent that was real, what contributed to it, if there's something that contributed to it that we haven't discussed, and what were some of the counterpoints? What were some of the parts that maybe didn't feel like we were in unity? And I guess the other thing I will just say is, if we talk about any institution that we were at the time, whether it's UNC or someplace else, I would just acknowledge that this was an unprecedented event that every institution tried to manage to the best of its ability. And so if something emerges as a critique, it's not a critique of any particular college or university, or laudatory of anyone. Everyone was doing the best they could to scramble in a truly unprecedented situation. So in short, if there was a sense of coming together of unity, or there are things that contributed to that we haven't touched on, and what are the contrapoints of signs that the unity was not entirely there?
So I can respond to that, I think, in the abstract a little. On reflection, I think I experienced two things with respect to unity. The first was an increase in anti-Muslim hate speech and attacks on American Muslims that have carried through to the present moment. And these actions have a tendency to surge when political leaders indulge Islamophobia. That's still true today and can be tracked. And it's part of how evil works. There's a theologian named Howard Thurman who talks about evil as a kind of disintegration. The evil is what tears us apart from each other. And I think that has been indulged since that time. And so we have to be on guard about that. But I think there was also a kind of unity in our grief and in our woundedness. People sometimes look toward each other in those circumstances, and their healing, I think, in their, the kind of knitting of wounds, people sometimes find themselves closer together than they were before. And so I think there's hope there, but it's not just a moment of unity. I think it's an ongoing process.
Thank you. Other folks?
I think the unity was real, but it was transitory. And I just want to acknowledge Raj and Justin's role as student leaders in really motivating the student body to do all these wonderful things, beautiful gestures, really. We haven't talked about the faculty, and I think the faculty needs to be mentioned here because the faculty had an important role to play in leading teach-ins that really delved with the roots of terrorism, building out of Richard Cohn's initial address on Wednesday, September the 12th. There was a series of teach-ins on campus the students really participated in, led by many faculty. And that began to get the attention of Fox News and the right-wing media. And there began their drumbeat of criticism that the faculty was actually apologizing for Muslim terrorism, that our students were being brainwashed. And that's where the division began, on that point.
We'll talk about some more of the residuals down the road, but I do recall the criticism of the teach-ins as being sort of on brand for Carolina, and that wasn't said in a good way, and also the being sympathizers, being enablers of, and a bit of blaming the victims.
Yes.
Of the attacks. Yeah. Other folks' thoughts?
I feel like I'm going to be a bit of a downer here, but I would not say unity is a word that comes to my mind on this issue growing up. I think when you're the group that's made the enemy, when to this day our local mosque has police presence, anytime we have a large ceremony at every Eid gathering, there are officers there because it's for our safety. Yeah, any media representation of us, any war that was started, any families or friends that were displaced abroad. Again, anything as small as bullying in school, any hate crimes, any other people of color who were mistaken as Muslim who were attacked just because they looked Muslim or was perceived to be Muslim. These are all really disunifying things. These are very otherizing things to experience and to watch. I think even to the point, one of the 9/11 ceremonies that I had been a part of in college, I was part of a group of students who were at the memorial service, and we were reading a list. We all had pages of lists of people who had been killed on that day. And we literally stood there and read them all together in a group. And we had an interfaith leadership kind of service with a rabbi, an imam, and a Christian chaplain. And after the ceremony, one of the students who had participated in the service told me that she was made very uncomfortable that the imam spoke Arabic, or that Arabic had been used at this service at all. Obviously, our religious texts are in Arabic. However, just the fact that hearing Arabic had made her uncomfortable to that point just made me realize, how ingrained it was that we are dangerous, or, for her to have just felt that level of uncomfort from the language, and also just the fact that how homogenized we had been made as well. Muslim speakers, are of so many language backgrounds. I don't even really speak Arabic that well at all. And there are many people of other faiths who speak Arabic. So just the fact that even, anything that was associated with the faith had made someone so uncomfortable just made me realize how broad of a brush we had been stroked with to be so otherized at that point.
And the enduring stereotyping, your comment about the language, I've taught in Saudi Arabia several times, and my teaching there started 15 years after the attacks, but the response of friends, family, and colleagues to my decision to teach there was resonant of what you're talking about, Yasmin.
Yeah, if I could pick up on Yasmin's points, we saw the horrific impact of Islamophobia at UNC. I remember my wife and I moved to Boston, and where I'd gone for training, and then she had as well, as she's a psychologist, and we had come back to to Raleigh and Chapel Hill between 2014 and 17 to raise our children near our family members. And she started working at the Student Health Services as a therapist. And it was during that time in 2015 that that 3 Muslim students, including one that was a UNC dentistry student, were shot. And that has been described as a hate crime. And, that is, my wife, when she was at Student Health, had just described having to care for one of the folks who witnessed that crime. And it was another person in the UNC community. And so that's 14 years after the event. And, whether or not one can attribute it to that or not, it matters less. One could argue that it does. And the point is, it's the same virus of hate that that we all feared on that day. I agree, James, the unity was transient. And 15 years later, 14 years later, you see some amongst others. That's just the one that all of us know well. But as Jasmine said, it doesn't count the fear, the other forms of violence, the other forms of hatred that have been expressed since that day, both in UNC, across Chapel Hill, across the state of North Carolina, and across the country.
Thank you. Anyone else want to? So if we could talk a bit about, you've started on this, but some of the residual effects and some of the ongoing ethical challenges for leaders, for allies. One that comes to mind here on campus was about the some reading selection the year after the book selection the year after the attacks, and wonder, Chancellor Meeser, if you'd talk a little bit about that. Justin and Raj had moved on to I think both had graduated, and we were here plowing on. If you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that was a moment.
I actually, this is one of my favorite topics, because I think this is one of the moments that UNC really rose to the occasion. But in the fall of 2002, or in the late summer of 2002, I got a call from the faculty committee that chose the book. It was then a required reading assignment for every first-year student. The university no longer has this requirement in place, and I regret to say, because I thought it was really a good thing that we did. And the faculty member said, "Chancellor, what would you think about a book about the Quran?" And I thought, that's a great idea. I never dreamed that it would be so a national controversy. That didn't enter my mind. I thought it was just really an appropriate thing for us to do. And the book was Approaching the Quran by Michael Sells, who was a scholar at Dartmouth College, I think. It's a book. It's a very gentle book about the surahs in the Quran, which are some of the most pastoral poetry ever written. It's beautiful language, and beautiful. It's meant to be sung, and I thought it was just a great experience. It really built on that Fox News reaction to the faculty workshops, the sessions that were these wildcat sessions that were held outside of class informally about the roots of terrorism. And Bill O'Reilly got wind of this and made it a major sensation. And Justin, you mentioned Professor Kirkpatrick. I never will forget, Robert Kirkpatrick was actually on the O'Reilly Factor. He brought him on his show, and it was a great moment for a UNC professor to encounter one of these, dare I say, negative characters on Fox News. And at one point, Kirkpatrick said, well, if you read the book, how could you say this? And he said, Bill O'Reilly said, oh, I haven't read the book. Oh. It was just a magical moment. He was railing about something he'd never even read. And that was, so ultimately, I said it's a proud moment because it allowed me to champion academic freedom on behalf of the whole university and on behalf of higher education everywhere. I thought we were able to carry the torch for it. So I was actually proud to be at the helm at that moment. And one of my proudest achievements was actually speaking to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. To describe that whole series of events. And I remember saying to the National Press Club, we were actually sued by the Family Policy Council to stop this reading series, to stop these discussions. And they were accusing us of trying to convert our students to Islam. And I remember saying to the National Press Club, no one was converted on that discussion day. Carolina's religion remains unchanged. It's basketball.
Exactly. It seems such a foreign concept to me. Like, I don't understand what people expect of a university. If we're trying to seek to understand what happened or the events that led up to September 11th, or how we're navigating how that makes us feel and how we then in turn react or respond, that intellectual curiosity is essential and at the core of what a university does, for sure, but it's certainly what we should be doing when we're trying to explore why these catastrophic events happen. And you can trace the reaction then to like the reactions that we have now, being in healthcare and being a physician. If you look at the resistance to information, resistance to expertise, resistance to academia, I just remember in that moment, while we weren't unified in a lot of ways, I think one of the ways to navigate the uncertainty of that situation is the curiosity to understand what is happening around us and the places around us and the things that we may not have seen or understood, or the things that we thought we knew about who we were as a country. It was imperative that we explored that. And I know before we left the university and graduated in, I guess 2002. That seems so long ago. Oh my gosh. But anyway, when we graduated, before then, I know that there was some curiosity and discussion about whether or not the university should engage in a business school in the Middle East and in Qatar. And we wanted to have a conversation about that as well, and established a seminar to be able to kind of explore what that conversation looked like. And as much as student leaders sometimes clash with their, with university leadership and administration, I do think that in that time, James, you and the, campus community were really receptive to our curiosity and our need to learn, and the duty as like leaders and adults and, the faculty needing to help navigate and help us guide, give us guidance through that situation. And so we had a seminar to kind of explore the questions around the Middle East and what, this all meant. And after 9/11, what the world looked like through that lens of such, such catastrophe. and whether or not we needed to change the approach of how we engage the world, how we change the approach to how we as a university feel like we are, and how we move through space. But it's imperative to me, like when something happens that we're confused by, or something that happens that we're scared of, it's really important for us to seek to understand. And I really cherish the experiences at UNC for challenging what I thought I knew, but also allowing me to challenge what the university community, knows as well, and what leadership, the administration, thought they knew as well.
I agree with that sentiment 100%, Justin. That's really well put. So when I teach about Islamophobia, I've used this Quran controversy as one of the sort of units I teach about as an example of a kind of Islamophobia that's opposed to teaching and learning. And so when I met Chancellor Meiser for the first time, I was able to say, you're a big hero on my syllabus. You see, that's always a good thing. When you meet somebody important, it's nice to be able to say that. But, it tells me a couple of things. One is there's a real confusion about learning about religion. It's confused as an attempt to convert somebody, right? And that's not what learning about religion is. It's not an attempt to convert. And the second thing is that Islamophobia, like part of how it thinks, and Jasmine said this talking about the broad brush, is it wants to present Islam and Muslims as monolithic and as the enemy. And Islamophobia knows that if you learn anything, if you actually meet Muslims, you're going to upset that narrative. And there is power and money and hatefulness attached to that narrative. So I think one inflection point for universities, and this is what Justin was saying, is that part of the university mission is confronting that lie whenever you see it. And how do you do that? You do it through teaching and learning.
That's right. Amen.
And I would say, and candor too. So if we were talking earlier, Jasmine and I, about incidents of that were labeled vandalism or graffiti instead of anti-Semitic or anti-Islam or hate crimes. And so the sort of not naming it is part of, I think, the challenge of seeing what's in our midst and trying to overcome it. Other folks may disagree, but that's, I think, the place of candor is central here.
To jump onto this conversation, I always think it's very funny when people kind of conflate learning about Islam, especially with us trying to convert people, because growing up in North Carolina, I cannot tell you how many times I've been asked if I was saved. And it is not something you will have been asked by a Muslim person. I can promise you, because we don't convert people. So it's just very interesting to me, because I'm like, you guys are the ones who always ask me, have I found Jesus yet? So that's just my experience, not the other way around. The residual effects, though, I will say, are definitely to this day. I think that I would be doing my Afghan and Iraqi friends a disservice if I didn't, for a moment at least, take us out of the context of the US for a second. I think again, this is also not to I don't want somebody to take this out of context. This is not to downplay 9/11 in any sort of way. It was tragic, traumatic, horrendous. Contrary to any conspiracy theory that you've heard, Muslims do not celebrate 9/11. There is no association with goodness for us on that day. We grieved it just like everyone else, even though it kind of felt we weren't allowed to grieve it. But the US had a response, right? And that response was war, and it was a war on terror. And we went into Iraq at first over weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. So that was a lie. We inflicted a lot of civilian casualties, caused a lot of trauma through things like Abu Ghraib. We have a prison called Guantanamo Bay that is still open. There are people who have not had trials. There are millions of displaced people internally within Afghanistan. You now see a refugee crisis after our abrupt leave. Because of our dissolution of power in the Middle East, you've had groups rise like ISIS. That's how they fostered. That's how they found place to come to be and cause more harm. And so I think if we're talking about, especially on this panel, justice and healing, I don't think you can ignore what happened after 9/11 and how we reacted to it. And I think the main realization is that these cycles of violence do not lead to justice and healing. Our military industrial complex does not cause peace. It causes more death, more pain, more displaced people. And it has honestly, I think, in the view of my friends and family, especially abroad, has tainted the US as a beacon of justice or peace or honesty or anything like that. We are not held on the global playing field in that light because of our actions in response. And internally in the US, I just think Islamophobia has not died down. It helps that Trump is no longer president. It leaps and bounds during his presidency. Maybe even more so than I saw directly post 9/11. The Islamophobia under his presidency was very high. And even people who were not born during 9/11 were, Muslim, Gen Z Muslims still experienced bullying while they were in school, even though this was an event that they don't even remember. And I was super surprised to have heard that. I know that we have some clips. I don't know if we are able to share them now, but
sure, this is a great time.
I did interview 2 Gen Z Muslims as part of the Me and My Muslim Friends podcast about their post 9/11 experience, and you'll get to hear them now speak for themselves.
After getting bullied in middle school, I would literally look at the calendars for like the following year and just try to see if 9/11 falls on a weekend so that I'm not in school on that day, just so I can avoid the stares or the conversation around it. Because I grew up in a rural area of North Carolina, so I wasn't surrounded by many Muslims as well, and I didn't hide my identity. I mean, my people saw my mom who wears the hijab and obviously knew I was Muslim and that she was Muslim. And so all of the eyes would just turn around, like look at me during while talking about 9/11 in school. So I would just really, really hope that it would end on a weekend or fall on a weekend so that I just did not have to deal with the questions or the bullying, the jokes, the judgment. Yeah.
Over the years, I've grown more confident in who I am, and I don't feel necessarily that urge to be so defensive and to be so I know who I am and I know what my religion is, and I think a lot of people have begun to understand that these misconceptions about Muslim people are not true at all.
It's a reminder, going back to the unity question, that 9/11, what may be a day of remembrance and service may be also a day of sort of incredible pain and judgment. And during the first speaker, I was reminded of a Saudi physician who I was teaching at, who said she came to do a postdoc and or a fellowship and was signing in and asked the person next to her what the date, if they had the date, and the person said, "You of all people should know." It was, the date was 9/11, and the person turned. And also my work with Saudi engineers who feel that their interests in engineering are somehow nefarious and intended to bring harm here in the US. So the international perspective is really potent, and I appreciate you bringing that to the fore. I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Jen will help us filter those in. In the meantime, I'll invite other comments or observations from folks on the panel.
I do think, to build on Yasmin's point, that it made us more conscious of the rest of the world, and I think that to Josh's point about teaching and learning, the more we can do to engage at the earliest possible stage in someone's life, that global view, it's just so critical and vital. It's Rumi, right, that says, if the wound is where the light enters, and I think that is only in poetry unless we act and try to actively let the light enter. My life was completely changed by that time, by the consciousness that was there. It was a year and a half later. I was a first-year medical student and went to Afghanistan to work as a reporter and a journalist and look at healthcare issues there. And that same line has now impacted my entire focus on social inequities and in healthcare as a doctor, as a public health, as a professor. And so I do think that I had the privilege of having grown up in a different country and coming to the United States and was already oriented globally. But I think the more we can do through education to do that, to create familiarity that breeds curiosity, that breeds empathy, and to allow people to connect in that way, I think that it's the only way we let the light in, from these horrific wounds that so many here around the world in such deep, lasting ways have felt.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I was just thinking earlier today, if you wanted to have a group of people who were kind of a think tank around, like peace and justice and reconciliation and things like that, especially around this issue, I felt like Muslim millennials would be so great in that position, because we do have so much empathy for so many aspects of this. We are American. We did grieve this thing that happened to our country, this horrible attack that happened to our country. And then we also grieved for our friends and family abroad at the same time, because of what we were doing to those countries. And I think just that amount of empathy and being able to see the full picture, that kind of global citizen perspective is really important today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
work,
thinking, Yasmin, about, you mentioned global citizen, and there were efforts after, since 9/11, right? A good friend of mine, Abby Fallick, runs a group called Global Citizen Year, and they promote the idea of high school graduates taking a gap year before they come to college. I imagine there are probably UNC students who've gone through that program, but she sends folks, she connects students to go live abroad in a homestead for a year and to learn to contribute to the community. There's, obviously the United States government has supported the Peace Corps for such a long time, and many UNC students had, I know my year, Justin's year, many were going off to do that. But more of those initiatives, I just think there couldn't be enough.
That's right.
I mean, I think in addition to those initiatives, and again, we talk about this intellectual curiosity, but I think it's also about identifying the accountability that's necessary for these institutions of, higher learning and, governmentally, like we need to be accountable for the harm that we've induced as well, in order to be able to create that space to, I think, authentically inform, educate, and really cultivate the empathy that we're talking about, to build that connection and to, be able to bring about, that change that we want to see. It's really important to, hold space for that as well. Because, we don't necessarily always get that right. And the line to historical truth isn't necessarily always linear. And I think sometimes we have to kind of circle back and be accountable for the harm that we, participate in, or the harm of our interpretations and perspectives in certain events. So taking opportunities like this 20 years later to reflect really gives an opportunity to provide some clarity in how we view, certain experiences, and truly the role that we played in those moments.
This is
I
all
will just
beautifully
say-
put.
Go ahead,
Just
go
to
ahead,
say,
Josh.
I'll just note one thing, that there's a verse in the Quran that says that God made us into different nations and tribes so that we could get to know each other.
Not that we would despise each other. Yeah.
Precisely so.
Mhm.
Thank you. James.
I was just thinking that prejudice exists because of ignorance. And so I'm convinced that the university and lower education is the answer. I mean, you're right. We need empathy, but we need intelligence as well.
And I'll platform two other needs on top of that. One is we need to be skilled in discourse, and in my work in ethics, ethical dilemmas are competing goods, competing rights. It's not, and so the ability to rest in discomfort with complexity and challenge and is really vital. And I guess the other thing also born of my research that I think is important is moral courage. The ability to, with the willingness to act on principle despite harm. And I think of Jasmine, your example of sort of dual loyalties, and you talked about that in terms of empathy, but also being able to speak to a counter narrative when in the midst of sort of the current is going in the other direction. That's moral courage. I mean, there are whistleblowers and people that will have us find our accountability. I know that the Quran book, the Michael Sells book, was challenging and brought a lot of mail into the university. Josh, I'll let you speak for a second about the archive before we post it, but I also know it was a challenging leadership moment. And so I'm just going to give a shout out for moral courage that I see in all of you, and that I will, I think is vital. Other pieces to add?
I think for me, just since the focus is also on schools, I mean, I'm surprised, Lean, who spoke on that clip, who's someone who's visibly Muslim, when they were going to be talking about 9/11 in schools, I'm surprised her teacher didn't try to make sure she was comfortable or that she wasn't receiving stares from her classmates. And why was that not a discussion, that you had in the classroom about why are you looking at her during this conversation? She was a year old when this happened, just be able to open up, why is this prejudice happening? Or even to put your foot down and say it's not allowed in my classroom, so that she would feel safe there instead of wishing that 9/11 wasn't a school day so she wouldn't have to deal with it. And that's a minor, stares are, I'm talking the most minor thing at this point that you would experience in terms of Islamophobia. But for me, one of the reasons why I even chose UNC journalism is I was accepted to the journalism school a week before Dia, Yusur, and Razan were murdered. And my advisor called me. Again, I had only even spoken to him in my interviews. Dr. Linden at the J School called me and he said, I might be making an assumption, but I know what your background is. And I just want you to know if you come here, you would be safe. And this is a really welcome school. And I would really value you coming to this program. And I had applied to several other programs. No one did that. And I don't think that's something that a lot of students have experienced. So just the courage for him to have, I literally remember he said, I don't know if this is the appropriate thing to do. And it was very much the appropriate thing to do. I didn't feel like a number coming into the program. I felt like a student who was going to be seen and valued. And I accepted, I put in my acceptance very quickly after that. There was no other consideration for me.
Thank you so much for that example.
I was going to say also thank you for, and that's a great example, and that's a great faculty member. And I would say to that teacher in that high school, she's a failed teacher because she should have spoken up. She should have been sensitive to the Muslim students' distress. She should have noticed that.
Yeah, it's, I used to be at high school. I was a public school teacher, and I had a cause history teacher. And colleague said to me one day, he says, "Josh, I never teach about Islam. I just ignore it." I said, "Why?" He says, "I'm scared. I'm scared that I'll say something, no matter what I say, and a parent will get angry, and it'll be very much like the Quran controversy at UNC, and I'll lose my job." And so it takes a lot of preparation, and it does take a degree of courage, not just on that teacher's part, but on the leadership's part, to reassure their teachers that they would be supported if they try and better prepare students to be global citizens.
I note the controversies today about critical race theory, and I see parallels in what you're saying for both the need to prepare for how content is taught, and also for the importance of a supportive context for doing that, and a trusting context. A question that came up or a couple of questions, and I'll let you speak to these as you like. And one is, and we may have broached these a bit already, but some practical suggestions for increasing empathy in our communities. And then your thoughts about what needs to happen for there to be a greater emphasis in the K-12 for teaching against Islamophobia. I'll let anybody go who wants to go.
I mean, I can speak to the first one. I look back to my time at Carolina. It was always service that helped generate empathy. To serve, and there's so many great ways of you're part of the UNC community to do that. You could go to the Campus Y, and you could sign up, or you could encourage if you are. For some of the service learning activities that have been ongoing, I think, for many, many years now. But that's always been the way. It's been the most authentic way, is to serve, is to get out of your comfort zone. And I would encourage that. I think serving others is a way to do it, and that can be in many ways. If you're not part of the UNC community, but you're outside of it, I think you can find other ways for community service.
I agree.
I can talk briefly about K-12 education. There's people who know much more about this than I do, but I would say that teacher preparation would be important, that they have the workshops, the formation opportunities to become more comfortable and conversant on religious studies, so they feel prepared to teach it. And I think having support right from the top, knowing that there are leaders with the moral courage to back you if when you teach topics that others do not want taught. They don't want their worldview to be shaken at all. They don't want to be global citizens, and so you have to push against that a little. I think that I think this is incredibly important, and there are people doing very good work. Pushing against that tide. Religious literacy in the United States is poor, and that's for all religions. And so if you believe religion's an important part of the human experience, then you must also believe that we should do more to teach and learn about it.
Geography is also very bad. I will add that one.
I guess in line with the service comment, the opportunities for engaging with a diverse group of peers, a diverse of sort of exposure to difference and openness to difference, and and being willing to put yourself in the spaces of sort of understanding others, I think both builds empathy and works against a lot of bigotries, inherent internal bigotries, etc. So that's a thought that occurs to me. Other folks?
I mean, I think to that point too, Kim, it's really about the will of like leadership and providing the opportunity for people of diverse backgrounds to be engaged, to be allowed to participate and be involved in changing the systems and the structures that are in place, whether it's in a school system, or quite frankly, like we're having similar conversations in my company as well, and like working through those details so that there is this cultural shift that creates a space for these conversations to happen is really critical and really important. It's one thing to set a goal for that, but it's a completely different thing if you are changing the structures that are inhibiting people's involvement and belonging in that context.
And I guess the other piece I'll platform on is about voice and who has a voice, and how, I read a quote in an article yesterday. It was about leadership, but or it was a failed leadership article, but about confirmation, about groupthink and confirmation bias being a hazard of leadership that doesn't invite advice. And so I will just put that in there of, not just representative, performative engagement, but truly seeing yourself as part of a team and valuing all voices.
I think also for the question that came in on lower level education and Islamophobia maybe in the classroom, I may advise also, I think a common tactic is just to ask people of diverse backgrounds to share and put the burden on them. And I think that's maybe especially unfair for kids. So if there was a way that you could create the program yourself and encourage involvement, but not put the burden on the student to share about their background or their stories. I mean, even for me, when I was working in journalism, newsrooms are very white. And there can be an assumption if you're a minority that you just want to cover minority topics, but no, I studied science and medical journalism. I wanted to write about public health and, all these other things. I didn't necessarily just want to write about who I am and people of my background and that sort of thing. So I think, pushing against tokenism a little bit and pushing against putting the burden on members of diverse communities to speak on behalf of everyone and share. But also another way you could approach it is there's so much richness. There's Islamic architecture, there's Islamic art, there's beautiful poetry and music and other things that you could go into that's not like, hey, let's read a passage from the Quran, just like exposing also just how broad and how many countries we all come from. There's Sufism. My mom is Shia, my dad is Sunni. A lot of people experience our religion really differently. There are many different denominations, which a lot of people don't realize. If there's any way that you can highlight the diversity within the religion, I really encourage it. Because otherwise you get a chapter in a textbook that God knows who when it was written, and just not a lot of context and not a lot of real world basis for what they're learning in school as well.
Thank you. Go ahead.
That allows me to put in a word for the arts. I remember that a few years ago, Carolina Performing Arts had a whole season of Sufi non-Arabic Muslim Islam, and Emil Kang went around the world actually, seeking out these little known Sufi artists. Carl Ernst with him to make it possible, and the arts are where we demolish these stereotypes. The arts, I'm obviously a tremendous advocate for what the arts can do to democratize our culture.
James, do you still play the organ much?
I don't play the organ anymore.
Oh, okay.
Susan still does.
Okay, I was just gonna ask. I saw that she's in the audience as well, but yeah, I meant to ask it earlier, and yeah.
Thanks for asking.
But a continuing champion. I will just say, let me wrap us up here by saying thank you so much to each of you for your being willing to bring your recollections and perspectives to this conversation, and to provide food for thought as well as guidance about a variety of things having to do with our world and leadership and the lessons we take away from crises that influence who we become in our personal and professional spaces. And we will post some information on the site here, as Jen has been doing, and I will certainly make sure that we have information linked on our website as well. But on behalf of the audience and me as your moderator, I just really want to say thank you and wish you all well. And I think we're all better for the time we spent in this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you
Thank
guys.
you. Bye.
Yeah, likewise. Bye.
Bye-bye.